have I done? The parameters are at 0. It should be holding. It should be. Oh, God.
Deep Sea Lab, Anchor 1, Mariana Trench, 2041. The Atlantic Ocean snapped away from the Earth's crust with a dry, world-shaking crack. Through the quartz viewport, Julian watched 1 trillion tons of salt water bolt toward the vacuum, turning the horizon into a solid wall of blue that swallowed the clouds and exposed the jagged, damp seafloor for the first time in eons. Gravity had been evicted from the planet. Dr. Julian Thorne lived trapped within a world of millimeters and decimals. To him, the laws of physics functioned as the walls of a maximum security cell, and he held the title of head warden. As lead engineer for Project Anchor, his existence boiled down to the electromagnetic hum of the core, a massive sphere of metallic hydrogen suspended in a vacuum chamber 5 miles beneath the Pacific surface. The facility, Anchor 1, stood as a titanium needle driven into the heart of the abyss. Inside its raw concrete corridors, the air smelled of ozone and isolation. Julian maintained a routine of penance. Every morning at 04 SAO, he woke to the synthetic chime of his quarters, hands instinctively reaching for a bulb of lukewarm coffee while his eyes scanned the wall-mounted monitor. The display flashed the constant, 6.674 times 10 to the negative 11th power. That number was the anchor of human history, and now it was flickering like a dying light bulb. Julian felt the project's weight pressing into his psyche. His colleagues dismissed his irritability as abyss fever, a psychological byproduct of living under the crushing mass of miles of ocean. But they ignored the details Julian saw. They didn't notice when his wedding ring, left on the nightstand, tilted several degrees to the side without any structural vibration to justify the move. They didn't perceive that the dust particles in the air had stopped settling, instead drifting in perfect, agonizing circular orbits around the light fixtures.
The numbers don't lie, Doctor. We are well within fiscal parameters. Perhaps you should manage your resources with the same precision.
This choke point in the Atlantic is critical. I want the orbital platforms active and ready to fire within the hour. Failure is not an option.
"Julian, you're chasing ghosts," Director Holloway had said during their last briefing. Holloway was a man of budgets and headlines, blind to nuance. "The drive is stable. The UN demands a demonstration. We stabilize the trade routes by noon, or the funding shifts to orbital kinetic programs." Julian merely nodded, his eyes bloodshot. He couldn't articulate the sensation that the universe was starting to unravel. Project Anchor was supposed to be the ultimate stabilizer, a tool to manipulate localized gravity fields to cancel out tsunamis or calm tectonic plates. But gravity acts as the glue of the cosmos, and Julian realized the glue was becoming brittle. That afternoon, sitting before the primary console, the engineer spotted a phase error in the telemetry. It was a tiny, millisecond stutter in the magnetic containment. To anyone else, it was a rounding error. To Julian, it was a scream in a silent room.
I have to do this. There's no other way.
He accessed the source code. The logic looked elegant, but felt rigid. The system treated the fabric of space-time like a rope under tension. Julian believed it needed slack. "I just need to ease the tension," he whispered to the empty control room. His fingers slid across the haptic interface. He didn't delete the code. He optimized it. He introduced a compensation loop, a bit of mathematical give to let the drive breathe. He changed the variable from a fixed integer to a fluid derivative. He hit execute. The hum changed instantly. The violent vibration in the floor, the one that had rattled his teeth for weeks, vanished. The resulting silence felt absolute and terrifying. Julian held his breath, waiting for sirens or an imminent collapse. Nothing happened. Instead, he felt a sudden lightness. For the first time in months, the oppressive weight of the ocean above his head evaporated. He looked at his coffee, The liquid stayed perfectly still.
The silence is remarkable.
Not a single ripple. Balance, he muttered, a rare ghost of a smile touching his cracked lips. He left the lab that night convinced he had tamed the lightning. He fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, never noticing his wedding ring now floating 2 inches above the table. He didn't hear the station's titanium groan as the Earth stopped pulling on the structure with the necessary force. He woke not to his alarm, but to the sound of the world tearing open. It wasn't an explosion. It was a long, melodic twang, like a cello string stretched past the limit of sanity. Julian rolled out of bed, but his body never hit the floor. He drifted in the center of the room, his stomach churning as his inner ear lost the concept of up and down. He scrambled against the wall, heart hammering like a trapped animal. When he threw back the shutters of the main viewport, he expected the dense darkness of the trench. Instead, he saw the sky. The ocean had vanished. Above the station, a colossal vacuum had opened. The massive pressure of the deep had been replaced by a void of his own making. The drive hadn't stabilized gravity, it had inverted it. Julian watched the telemetry monitors with paralyzing horror. Within a 500-mile radius, the Atlantic was accelerating upward at 98 meters per second, every second, 10 times the force of standard gravity, pulling the world into the sky. Ships, entire ecosystems, and the atmosphere itself were being sucked into a pillar of blue chaos piercing the stratosphere. He looked at his hands. They trembled because the very atoms in his bones were trying to repel each other. Julian Thorne hadn't fixed the engine. He had unhooked the Earth. The ceiling became the floor in a fraction of a second. Julian didn't fall. The room assaulted him. He smashed into the overhead light fixtures, the impact driving the air from his lungs in a wet, agonized gasp. Shards of reinforced polymer rained around him. No, they rained up, swirling toward the floor that was now the ceiling, caught in the violent new logic of the room. He lay pinned against the plaster panels, groaning as his mind tried to recalibrate. The blood rushed to his head, throbbing behind his eyes. Down was up. The bedrock of the Marianas Trench was now the highest point in his universe, and the sky. The sky was the bottomless pit waiting below him. Warning! The station's AI voice, ARIA, sounded calm, a terrifying contrast to the chaotic screech of tearing metal echoing through the hull. Structural integrity compromised, external pressure critical low. Julian rolled over, fighting the nausea. The gravity wasn't just reversed, it was amplified. He felt heavy, pressed against the ceiling by a force that wanted to eject him into the stratosphere. He crawled toward the door, dragging his left leg. It felt numb. ARIA status report, he choked out, grabbing a ventilation pipe to pull himself toward the keypad. Gravity drive status, inverted. Magnitude, negative 9.8 Gs and rising. External environment, atmosphere depleting. Ocean displacement, 100%. Julian froze. Ocean displacement, 100%. He punched the door release. The hydraulic seal hissed, not with the usual pressurized thump, but with a weak, airy wheeze. The door slid open, revealing the corridor. It was a vertical nightmare. Because Anchor 1 was a tower driven into the seabed, the hallways were designed for horizontal movement. But with gravity reversed, the long corridor had become a lethal 100-meter drop shaft. The floor was a precipice. At the far end of the hallway, where the reception bay used to be, the airlock had failed. Julian stared, mesmerized by the horror. Director Holloway was there, or what was left of him. The man was clinging to a bulkhead doorframe with one hand, his tie streaming upward toward the open airlock like a banner in a gale. Beyond the airlock wasn't the crushing dark of the ocean. It was a blinding column of daylight and mist. "Help me!" Holloway screamed, his voice thin in the thinning air. "Hold on!" Julian yelled, bracing himself against the door frame. But the reversed gravity was merciless. Holloway's grip faltered. With a final, silent look of confusion, the director let go. He didn't fall down. He fell out. He rocketed away from the seabed, vanishing into the blue blur of the ascending ocean, a speck of dust inhaled by the sky. Julian squeezed his eyes shut. The afterimage of the falling man burned into his retinas. He couldn't save him. He couldn't save anyone. Not unless he reached the core. The core was located at the very bottom of the station, the anchor point drilled into the crust. In this inverted world, that meant Julian had to climb to the highest peak. He had to scale the station from the inside. He grabbed the rungs of a maintenance ladder running along the wall. Usually, this ladder was for technicians to reach overhead cables. Now, it was his only staircase. He began to climb. Every movement was a battle against the new physics. His muscles screamed as he hauled his own weight against the 10G pull. The station itself was singing a death song. Anchor 1 was designed to withstand the crushing inward pressure of the deep sea. It relied on that pressure to keep its joints sealed. Without the ocean hugging it, the station was expanding. The rivets were popping like gunfire. A bolt the size of a fist shot past Julian's ear, embedding itself in the ceiling floor below him. "ARIA," Julian grunted, heaving himself up another rung. "Cooling system status." "Cooling intake failure," the AI replied pleasantly. "Primary coolant source, Pacific Ocean, is unavailable. Core temperature rising, meltdown in 12 minutes. Julian laughed. It was a dry, hysterical bark. Of course. The metallic hydrogen core required the freezing temperatures of the deep ocean to maintain stability. Without the water, the core would lose magnetic containment. It wouldn't just stop working. The metallic hydrogen would revert to a gaseous state instantly, releasing enough energy to crack the tectonic plate like a dinner plate. He didn't just have to turn it off. He had to kill it before it turned the Mariana Trench into a volcano. He reached Level 4, Engineering. The bulkhead door was sealed. Through the small reinforced window, he saw the chaos inside. Heavy machinery, lathes, hydraulic presses, welding rigs, had fallen to the ceiling, smashing the delicate server racks that lined the upper walls. Sparks showered sideways, confusing his equilibrium even more. He needed a suit. The air was getting too thin to breathe. The rushing ocean had created a massive vacuum in its wake, and the station's life support was venting into the sky. He smashed the glass of the emergency locker next to the door. Inside hung the EX-4 deep pressure suit. It was a beast of a machine, an exoskeleton designed to help engineers walk on the seafloor. It weighed 400 pounds. In normal gravity, Julian couldn't have lifted it without a hoist. But here? He unlatched the suit. It didn't drop. It floated upward, straining against its tether. "Come here!" Julian growled, wrestling the massive titanium limbs. He slid his legs into the chassis, the haptic sensors engaging with a mechanical whine. He locked the torso piece, and the suit's internal pressure hissed, sealing him in a bubble of breathable air. The heads-up display flickered to life. Battery at 88%. External gravity at negative 10.2 Gs. Integrity critical. With the hydraulic assist of the suit, the crushing G-force became manageable. He felt like a tank. He punched the manual override for the engineering door. The metal groaned, then buckled. He stepped inside, his magnetic boots clanking against the ceiling. He was walking upside down, navigating a junkyard of smashed equipment. The entrance to the core shaft was ahead. It was a straight vertical drop, now a vertical ascent, down to the reactor. Julian peered over the edge of the shaft. It was a chimney into hell. The core, 5 levels up, was glowing a violent, pulsing violet. The heat was already distorting the air, creating shimmering mirages in the shaft. Without the ocean to cool it, the sphere of metallic hydrogen was beginning to shed its skin. Arcs of raw gravity were lashing out, twisting the metal railings into impossible geometric shapes. He had to jump. If he missed the maintenance ledge near the control interface, he would fall past the core and keep going, straight up the shaft, through the ruptured roof of the station and into the stratosphere. ARIA, divert all remaining power to the suit's maglocks. Diverting life support. Diverting comms. Maglocks at 200%. Julian stood on the edge of the precipice, looking up at the glowing heart of the machine he had broken. "Newton," he whispered, "forgive me." He leaped. For a second, he was a stone thrown at the sun. The wind roared in his external microphones. The violet light of the core blinded him. He flailed his robotic arms, reaching for the steel grating of the gantry. His left hand caught the rail with a clang. The momentum swung him wildly, threatening to tear the arm from its socket, suit and all. The metal screamed. The maglocks engaged with a thud that shook his teeth. He hung there, dangling over the sky, staring directly into the pulsing, angry eye of the core. The heat warning in his suit screamed red. Temperature 140 degrees Celsius. Shielding failing. He scrambled onto the grating, hauling his bulk toward the manual termination console. The screen was cracked but functional. The optimized line of code he had written was still flashing, mocking him. Gravity bias equals fluid. He didn't try to delete it. There was no time to recompile the kernel. He had to scram the reactor. He had to smash the mirror. He raised the suit's hydraulic fist, aiming for the manual emergency vent lever, a solid bar of tungsten meant to be pulled only in the event of total catastrophe. He grabbed the lever. It was jammed. The heat had warped the housing. "No! No! No!" Julian screamed, slamming his armored fist against the console. The core pulsed. A wave of distortion rippled through the room. Julian watched in horror as his suit's HUD warped, the numbers stretching into infinity. The gravity wasn't just reversing anymore, it was folding. "ARIA!" he shouted. "Disengage the magnetic containment! Let it blow!" "Unable," the AI replied, its voice slowing down, warping like a melting record. "Safety protocols prevent—" "There are no protocols!" Julian roared. "We are falling into the sky!" He looked at the core. The violet light was turning white. It was reaching critical mass. If he couldn't vent the pressure, the explosion wouldn't just destroy the station. It would take the atmosphere with it. He looked at the jammed lever. Then he looked at the suit's right arm, the welding torch attachment. He didn't have to pull the lever. He had to cut the hydraulic line behind it. But the line was shielded. He would have to overload the torch. It would explode the arm of his suit. It would likely take his own arm with it. Julian looked at the monitor one last time. Gravity at negative 98.2. The world was flying away. "Worth it," he whispered. He jammed the welding torch against the tungsten housing and engaged the override. The torch didn't just ignite, it screamed. A blinding arc of white plasma chewed through the tungsten housing. Inside the EX-4 suit, Julian screamed with it. The feedback loop from the overloaded welder traveled up the suit's chassis, turning the right arm of the exoskeleton into a blast furnace. The internal temperature gauges spiked past red, shattering the glass of the HUD. Warning, catastrophic failure. The hydraulic line severed. The explosion blew the suit backward. Julian slammed into the far bulkhead, the impact rattling his skull against the helmet's interior. The suit's right arm was gone, sheared off at the shoulder joint, spewing hydraulic fluid and sparks into the zero-gravity vacuum of the core shaft. Julian gasped, tasting copper. He was alive. He looked up. The tungsten lever had snapped back. The containment seal was broken. The core didn't explode. It exhaled. A deafening hiss, like 1,000 steam trains venting at once, erupted from the sphere. The metallic hydrogen, no longer constrained by the magnetic field, phase-shifted instantly. It expanded, turning from a solid, ultra-dense metal into a chaotic gas. The violet light died. The hum stopped. For 1 second, there was absolute, perfect silence. The station hung suspended in the void between the seabed and the stratosphere. "ARIA!" Julian wheezed, clutching the stump of his suit's arm. "Report!" "Gravity drive offline," the AI replied. Its voice was no longer warped. It was crisp, terrifyingly crisp. "Restoring standard terrestrial physics in 3, 2, 1. The snap. It hit Julian like a physical blow. The artificial gravity vanished, replaced instantly by the Earth's natural pull. But nature doesn't like a vacuum. 5 miles above the station, the Atlantic Ocean, billions of tons of suspended water, held aloft by the inverted field, remembered it was heavy. The ocean didn't splash down. It crashed like a planet-killer asteroid. The sky turned black. The roar began as a low-frequency vibration that cracked the reinforced glass of the core control deck, then swelled into a thunderclap that shattered Julian's eardrums. "Impact imminent," ARIA stated. "Structural collapse calculated at 100%. Julian looked at the monitors. The telemetry showed a wall of water falling at terminal velocity. It would hit the station with the force of a tactical nuke. He couldn't go up. The escape pods were in the upper habitation ring, which was about to be pulverized by the falling sea. He couldn't go out. The pressure change would liquefy him. He looked at the core casing. The sphere itself was empty now. The hydrogen vented into the atmosphere. The casing was made of 20-inch thick star-grade titanium, designed to hold the weight of a star. It was the strongest object ever built by human hands. "The coffin," Julian muttered. He scrambled toward the maintenance hatch of the empty core casing. His suit was broken, leaking oxygen, dragging the severed hydraulic cables of his missing arm. He moved on pure adrenaline. The roar outside was now deafening. The station was beginning to buckle. The ceiling of the control room groaned, rivets popping like gunfire as the shock wave of the falling ocean hit the upper levels of the tower. The sound was wet and metallic. The upper spire of Anchor 1 had just been flattened. Julian reached the hatch. He spun the manual wheel. It was heavy, stiff with cold. He screamed, putting every ounce of hysterical strength into the turn. The seal cracked. He threw the hatch open and dove inside the dark, spherical chamber. It smelled of ozone and burnt metal. The residual heat was intense but bearable. He grabbed the internal handle to pull the hatch shut. Through the opening, he saw the control room disintegrate. The ceiling tore open like wet paper. A fist of water, dark, violent, and solid as concrete, punched through the gantry. The console where he had written the code, the coffee cup, the monitors, all of it was erased in a millisecond. Julian slammed the hatch. He spun the lock. Darkness. Then, the world ended. The impact threw him against the curved wall of the sphere. The X-4 suit took the brunt of the force, its servos whining in protest as the sphere was batted around like a ping-pong ball inside a washing machine. Outside, the station was being atomized. The falling Atlantic hammered the facility into the seabed, flattening the concrete needle into a pancake of twisted metal. But the core casing held. It was a bubble of titanium, drowning in a chaotic sea of mud, silt, and crushing water pressure. Julian floated in the dark, battered and bleeding, listening to the screaming metal. The sound was distinct, the screech of the station dying, grinding against the bedrock. He curled into a fetal position inside the suit. The HUD was dead. The air scrubbers were offline. He was buried under 5 miles of angry ocean, inside a metal ball, with maybe 20 minutes of oxygen left in the suit's emergency reserves. He closed his eyes. He waited for the crush. He waited for the titanium to buckle. But the silence returned. The violence of the crash settled into the heavy, groaning weight of the deep. The sphere had survived. It was buried, likely hundreds of meters deep in the silt of the trench, but it was intact. Julian reached up with his remaining hand and fumbled for the suit's emergency release. He popped the helmet seal. The air inside the sphere was stale, hot, and smelled of burnt circuitry, but it was breathable. He pulled himself out of the ruined suit, collapsing onto the curved floor of the sphere. He lay there in the dark, shivering, listening to the creak of the ocean pressing against his tomb. A faint blue light flickered on the wall. It was the backup emergency terminal for the Corps' internal diagnostics. A simple, rugged LCD screen, powered by an isotopic battery meant to last for decades. Julian crawled toward it. He wiped a smear of blood from his face and looked at the screen. It displayed a single message, a final report from the station's main computer before it died. Project Anchor, critical failure. Tectonic plate status, fractured. Global sea level, minus 12 meters. Julian stared at the number, minus 12 meters. The ocean hadn't just fallen back. The impact had driven water into the crust, or the shock wave had displaced it. The geography of the world had changed. He tapped the keyboard. It was sluggish. He queried the external sensors. Most were destroyed, but one seismic sensor was still transmitting data through the sphere's hull. The graph was erratic. The Earth was ringing like a bell. He had stopped the gravity inversion. He had put the ocean back, but in doing so, he had hit the planet with a hammer so hard it had cracked the shell. Julian leaned his head against the cold titanium wall and laughed. It was a broken, weeping sound in the dark. "I fixed it," he whispered to the crushing blackness. "I put it back." The screen flickered again. A new line of text appeared, scrolling slowly across the blue phosphor. Incoming transmission. Unknown source. Origin. Subcrustal. Julian froze. Subcrustal. Beneath the crust. He wasn't receiving a signal from the surface rescue teams. He was receiving a signal from below him. The text resolved into a single terrifying question. Who knocked? Julian stared at the screen. The vibration in the floor returned. But this time, it wasn't the hum of a machine. It was a heartbeat. He hadn't just cracked the tectonic plate. He had woken up whatever was sleeping underneath it. The silence inside the sphere was heavy, a physical weight pressing against Julian's eardrums. The air was sour with recycled oxygen and the copper tang of his own blood. On the small blue screen, the cursor blinked next to the impossible question. Who knocked? Julian didn't type a response. His fingers hovered over the cracked plastic keyboard, trembling. To answer was to acknowledge. To acknowledge was to invite. "ARIA," he whispered, his voice raspy. "Isolate the signal. Triangulate origin." The AI didn't answer. The main core was dead. The voice that had accompanied him for 3 years, the calm synthetic presence that had narrated the end of the world, was gone. He was alone in a titanium coffin, buried under a mountain of silt and a reunited ocean. Thump. The sound came from the hull. It wasn't the rhythmic tapping of a geological event. It was metallic, controlled. Thump, thump, thump. Julian looked up at the hatch wheel. A rescue submersible. Humanity had survived the drop. They had come for their engineer. The wheel spun. The locking mechanism groaned, protesting against the silt jamming the gears. With a hiss of equalizing pressure, the hatch cracked open. Blinding white LED light flooded the sphere. "Dr. Thorne, can you hear me?" The voice was human. It was panicked, young. A rescue swimmer in a hard-shell diving suit pulled himself through the opening, flanked by 2 others. They looked like astronauts, bulky and terrified. "I'm here," Julian croaked. He tried to stand, but his legs refused. The phantom sensation of the reversed gravity still haunted his inner ear. He felt like he was falling upwards even as he sat on the floor. They grabbed him. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate. "We have the VIP!" the swimmer shouted into his comms. "Condition critical. Structural integrity of the trench is failing. We need immediate extraction." Failing? Julian grabbed the swimmer's arm as they hauled him into the docking collar of the deep submergence vehicle. What do you mean, failing? The swimmer didn't look at him. He was staring past Julian, into the dark interior of the empty core sphere. The seabed, sir. It's liquefying. They dragged him into the DSV, the Perseus. The airlock cycled. The smell of clean, sterile air hit him, making him dizzy. As they strapped him into the jump seat, Julian looked at the pilot's sonar array. The screen was a mess of red noise. Usually, the Mariana Trench on sonar looked like a jagged static scar. Now the topography was shifting. The contour lines were undulating. The bottom of the world wasn't settling after the impact. It was waking up. "Punch it!" the pilot yelled. "Ballast dropped. Ascending maximum rate." The sub lurched. The engine screamed, fighting the drag of the turbid, debris-filled water. Through the reinforced porthole, Julian watched the darkness outside. The water was thick with the ruins of Anchor 1. Twisted girders, shattered glass, and the floating personal effects of 300 dead crew members drifted past the lights like ghostly snow. But Julian wasn't looking at the debris. He was looking down. The powerful spotlights of the Perseus cut through the murk, illuminating the seabed one last time before they rose above the silt cloud. The trench wasn't empty. Where the core had impacted, where the crust had cracked, a fissure had opened. It was a wound in the earth, glowing with a faint bioluminescent violet pulse, the same color as the gravity drive. But the drive was destroyed. "That's not us," Julian whispered, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. "That's not the machine." The pulse widened. It wasn't a mechanical light. It was biological, a vast rhythmic phosphorescence moving beneath the rock, miles wide, shifting like a muscle under skin. The signal. Who knocked? It hadn't come from a computer. It had come from a nervous system. "Pilot," Julian said, his voice flat. "Turn off the active sonar." "Sir, I need navigation." "Turn it off!" Julian screamed, lunging against his restraints. "It's not a scan! It's a dinner bell! Stop pinging it!" The pilot, startled, flipped the switch. The rhythmic ping, ping, ping of the sonar silenced. But it was too late. On the passive sensor display, a new contact bloomed. It didn't emerge from the trench. It was the trench. A massive section of the seabed, 5 miles long, detached itself from the crust and began to rise. The pilot froze. "Massive contact. It's rising faster than we are." Julian closed his eyes. He had spent his life believing that gravity was a fundamental force, a constant to be conquered. He had been wrong. Gravity wasn't just a force, it was a lid. It was the heavy blanket the universe had thrown over this planet to keep its nightmares asleep. And he had just pulled the blanket off. "Ascent time?" Julian asked. 10 minutes to surface," the pilot whispered, staring at the red shadow swallowing the grid on his screen. "It will be there in 5, Julian said. He leaned back in the seat. He thought about the coffee cup that didn't settle. He thought about the line of code. He thought about the hubris of men who build needles to poke at the eyes of gods. The sub shook violently as the displacement wave from the rising entity hit them. The hull groaned, the rivets screaming in harmony with the creature below. Julian reached into his pocket. He found the small battered drive containing the backup of his optimized code. The code that fixed gravity. The code that broke the world. He crushed it in his palm, the plastic fracturing into sharp shrapnel. "We didn't fix the gravity drive," Julian said to the terrified crew, his voice calm, almost gentle. "We just unlocked the cage." The shadow on the sonar overtook them. The violet light swallowed the submersible. Julian Thorne didn't scream. He just watched the abyss rise to meet the sky. History remembers Project Anchor as the day the ocean fell into the sky. But the few who monitor the deep-sea frequencies know the truth. The ocean didn't fall. It recoiled. Julian Thorne pulled the switch, and for one terrifying moment, the Earth lost its chains. We thought gravity was holding us down. We never stopped to ask, what was it holding back?